Hello, hello, and welcome back from lunch. We are so happy to get started this afternoon with our first panel of the afternoon, which is, I had to look, Digital Black Feminist Pleasure and Pain Online. I'm Catherine Knight Steele, and I am just ecstatic to share the stage with these brilliant feminist scholars. I am going to do a really brief intro, as I know that their biographies are in your book, but I think y'all need to hear about the amazing work that these women have been doing. I'm gonna start with Rihanna Walcott immediately to my left, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Black Communication and Technology Lab, part of the DISCO network. She'll be joining the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland this fall as an incoming assistant professor. That's hard to do. Her research investigates Black British social media usage and if and how discourse varies in different contexts with different demographics, how social network services and their attendant harms impact Black users, how they express themselves. Walcott co-founded ProjectMyopia.com in 2017, a website that promotes inclusivity in academia and decolonized curriculum. She writes about race, feminism, mental health, the arts and culture for publications like The Welcome Collection, The Metro, The Guardian, BBC, Vice, and Dazed. Dr. Walcott is also co-editor of an anthology about BAME mental health in the UK called The Color of Madness, and she moonlights as a professional jazz singer. Dr. Kishonna Gray is an incoming professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan. I feel like I just made some news. She is also a faculty associate in the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. Dr. Gray is the author of, ready? Intersectional Tech, Race, Gender, and Deviance in Xbox Live, and co-editor of Woke Gaming and Feminism in Play. She is working on yet another book right now called Black Game Studies. And this is a much shorter bio than it could be because she does all the things, so. Dr. April Williams is jointly appointed as an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Media and Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan. She's also a faculty associate in the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University and a former senior fellow in Trustworthy AI at Mozilla. She is the author of the recently released book, Not My Type, Automating Sexual Racism and Online Dating, published with Stanford University Press. As a multidisciplinary scholar of race and gender at the intersection of digital spaces and algorithmic technocultures. Now we have Dr. Brandy Pettyjohn, who created Black Feminist Techno Practice as a framework for digital storytelling. Black Feminist Techno Practice informs users' research experience by focusing on stakeholders and storytelling goals, merging them with the ways that audiences make meaning when interacting with digital storytelling vehicles, while implementing more aspects of pleasure and care in the production of using qualitative research methodologies. She has recently become the curator of exhibitions at Spelman College Museum of Fine Art, where she will focus on engagement and education initiatives between the campus communities in the Atlanta University Center and the greater Atlanta area. She is working as well on a book about Black digital visual culture. And finally, Dr. Francesca Savandi is a writer and senior lecturer in digital media studies at Cardiff University, where her teaching focuses on critical approaches to media, music, and meme culture. She is the author of, this is another list, y'all. She's the author of Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, Consuming Crisis, Commodifying Care and COVID-19, and Big Brands Are Watching You, Marketing Social Justice and Digital Culture. Francesca is also co-author, co-dreamer with Layla Roxanne Hill of Black Out There, Black Lives in Scotland, and the freely available and co-edited graphic novel and animation, Black Out There, Dreams O' Us. Francesca's recent research and writing primarily focuses on internet imaginaries, alternative music subcultures, desire on screen, and cultural memory. Her bylines include Disingenio, Paste Magazine, Real Review, The Skinny, The Vinyl Factor. She also enjoys writing in margins and embracing all things emo. Please join me in welcoming this amazing panel. Yes. I'm gonna start though because we can't have every single amazing Black feminist scholar on stage that we've tried. So I'm gonna start actually by shouting out Dr. Aria Holiday, who's here as well, and reading just a little piece from one of her books. First is in the foreword of her book, there is a lovely poem, I think, that kind of grounds us for this conversation from Gwendolyn Brooks that simply says, "Sisters, I love you because you love you, because you are erect, because you are also bent, in season, stern, kind, crisp, soft in season, and you withhold and you extend and you step out and you go back and you extend again."
Amen.
Dr. Holliday goes on to write, "For many of us as Black girls, we were regularly castigated for carrying ourselves in so-called womanish ways, and yet also disciplined for the abuses of men in our lives. Our joy in our bodies and pleasure in being fully ourselves were squelched or demonized for fear of what Black men or white people would do to us. Haunted by the indignities they had suffered and still suffer, our Black mothers and aunts and community members and religious leaders protected us through adultification. In this logic, being worthy of respect through our actions would save us from those who sought to do us harm. Respectability would save us. Much like our historical knowledge of Black girls in past times, we crafted adult attitudes and habits for the sake of protection. This protection, however, costs many of us knowledge of ourself and of joy." I want to use that to frame our conversation because I think, as Dr. Holliday points out in her book, there is a distinction between Black girlhood and Black womanhood, and we want to make sure that we are very careful today that we are having conversations in a way that actually honors Black girls and Black women as different stages in our lives. What I've asked these brilliant women to do today is to give us just a little bit of 5 minutes of what it means for them to encounter Black feminist pain and pleasure in their own work. And then we're gonna leave the majority of our time to be in conversation with one another and with you. And so with that, perhaps we can begin with Dr. Patty John?
Dang.
Oh, that's right. She said she didn't mind going first, so now she got to go first.
I did say I didn't care. Hi, everyone. So as a little bit of background on me, I start with Black feminism. That was my master's, that was my undergrad. So I come out of that tradition. And as I came into this Black feminist thought framework, was at a time where we were segueing out of, so I would say segueing into this pleasure dynamic. We were starting to talk about it and moving away from pain and resistance and all this stuff. And this is a while ago, right? So this is not the current moment. This is over a decade ago. And so as I entered this PhD program, I was not in a Black feminist space. But I had that language and that scholarship behind me. And I was really surprised that the other disciplines hadn't kind of moved with Black feminism, and that there was this really kind of stuckness in, like, can you tell us more about your pain? Oh, what happened? Can you visualize slavery in a digital format? Can we see a augmented hanging body? And so this kind of idea of like, show me your pain in a visual, digital way had not changed, right? The idea of that had not moved with feminist scholarship. Feminist scholarship was like way ahead, like we talking about something else, and they're back, the digital space is really talking about like doing the same things over, just let's do this online, let's do it in augmented reality and new media, but we're not doing it in a new way, we're just doing it augmented, we're doing it in virtual reality. And so to me, like the framework that I created, I feel a little bit bad because it's like, to me, it's like a no-duh framework, like, don't create harm, you know what I'm saying? So that's kind of how I entered this practice, but one of the things that I was talking about in this group, and one of the things that I wanted to think about, is the way that sadness comes up in our digital spaces, because one of the things that I've noticed is that we transmute, and I'm talking about Black folks specifically, transmute sadness and pain immediately into either resistance or into like a funny meme, because that's kind of what we do in life. Like, okay, how can we make this funny? How can we digest this hardness? And so this is the moment that we're at, is that how do we talk about hard things without reinscribing pain and trauma back into the people who we're trying to have conversations with in digital spaces. So that's kind of where I am. Do I need to talk more? I think we I can go on and on, but I heard that we had 5 minutes in the beginning, so I'm gonna stop there. Bang, bang.
So glad to be here. So glad to be in this space with them, y'all, us. I find ourselves doing a lot of like look backs, right? Even when you said like looking back like a decade ago, I was really interested to just find like those points of like joy and pleasure and pain like in my work. And, it was there. I remember having a conversation with one of our, senior Black digital scholars. And, he had made the comment, he said, well, your work has always been joy work, because I was like, hey, people are doing this joy thing. I want to do this joy thing. And he was like, what are you talking about? Like, you're already doing it. I was like, I am. And I actually sat back and like went back and reading. I was like, oh yeah, gaming and play, that is that. All the raging and toxicity, like that is all that struggle and pain, right? And then I remember sitting with, I went back and I sat with this, the Militant Misses. I'm not sure if any of you all know, if you've read my first book, you'll know the Militant Misses very well, yep. And I remember realizing and recognizing that they exist in that pleasure, pain, struggle, love, joy. You had a slide up earlier, Kat, and I took a picture of that, and I really appreciated that. But they went into gaming because it was like the space of escape, right? And then what they found, like, they often found themselves asking the question, like, what am I escaping from, right? They're escaping from homophobia, transphobia, like in their lives. They're escaping from the racism and the sexism. And then when they got online, then they found the community of each other. But then in the early days, this is like 20 years ago, y'all, this is like 2004 I'm talking about. But in those early days, they often found what they were still seeking from, right? And then it was like the affordances of the technologies that started to develop and emerge over time that allowed them to be able to create and curate, the spaces of like protection, and I just mean like, like party chats. I mean like your Discords and Twitch, like the spaces that have evolved and and the spaces that we are more in control of, that we can then, exist and coexist like in the spaces of like peace and calmness and like tranquility. And so whenever I wrote, like, let me write something down because there was something one of the things that was really interesting as I did that look back in the work was often think about how when we think about like joy and pain, we often think about the labor involved in creating both of those or trying to undo them or really trying to undo the pain, right? And so it was really interesting, like the Black men in the space, they fully went into like the labor of it. They looked at their gaming online as like labor. It's a serious thing, like, the hardcore kind of gamers. And really like a lot of the Black women in the femme and the queer space was completely opposite of that. Like, well, the casual gamers. Like, so I didn't use that word at the time, because we didn't, really talk about like the casual space like in that way. But it was really interesting just to see that look back and seeing how distinctly, that these, cis heterosexual Black men and mostly cis heterosexual, like Black women engaged in that space. But then there are the Militant Misses, this space of these very queer, disabled folks, and how they were doing both things simultaneously all the time, right? So they were able to like move in this space, like we're gonna be hardcore right now, but then okay, let's ease it up, let's be soft right now. Somebody girlfriend in the space, so she don't like all that hardcore shit or whatever, So it was really interesting just how they constantly went in and out of that all the time, and when you thought, as you were talking, I'm just thinking about like how at the core of their work is like Black feminism, how they were just miles ahead of like everybody else because they had already, a lot of them, I'm thinking about like the intersection, these are a lot of like folks now, they've got master's degrees and, professional degrees, and they did the reading like in school. And so they were already there and they implemented that like into their spaces. So it was just really interesting just to see how these concepts that we're talking about now have always like been in gaming, and how gaming is constantly trying to like push back and push down and take away the joy, and how folks still work to protect those kinds of spaces in there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so now we're going to talk about online dating.
Yeah, come on now.
Right, and that's the vibe. Why is that the vibe? That's really exactly what my perspective on joy comes from. I've been doing this work on online dating for about 7 years now, and I did 100 interviews for this book project where I talked to people all across the gender spectrum and across the sexuality spectrum about what it's like to date, all across the racial and ethnic spectrums too. And there's so much pain there. There's so much trying to find yourself, I think, and trying to find your partner or your playmates or whatever your situation is. And often it's both, right? And even though we're trying to find people with whom we connect and we thrive, so much pain is there. And so I really had to think about, what does it look like to have joy in dating? And also, why is it so hard for us to find joy in dating? And for me, it's like the joy can't always be at the end when you find your partner, right? And definitely for me, I will say I had fun the whole time. There were definitely some times when some people were not fun, but I'm gonna say I had a roster, my groceries was getting bought, I was eating meals, I didn't have to go shopping often. It was fun. I had a good time, right? That was my personal joy. I was having a good time. But at the same time, what I found in doing this work is that so much of our dating culture rhetoric is about, this is my type, this is the kind of person that I like, what are you bringing to the table, are you 50-50? And really, I would like for us all to deconstruct why we're so transactional in these intimate spaces. Why does it have to be, what do you bring to the table? What do I bring to the table? Are we going to quantify every bit of ourselves? And I think part of why we are doing that is because dating apps have taught us to do that, right? They reinforce these economies of desire, these economies of attractiveness, right? And so then we are then acting that out and living that in our everyday lives. And I think the last thing that I'll say about joy is really that we have to decolonize our own opinions of ourselves, right? I think if we traffic in these economies of desirability without deconstructing them, then we start to internalize, oh, well, I'm only a 5 or I'm only a 6 or I'm not that attractive as compared to so-and-so, right? When we know good and well beauty is in the eye of the beholder, what works for one person isn't gonna work for somebody else. And yet we act as though if you're not a 10, you're gonna have a horrible time in the dating economy, which I'm not saying it's easy for everybody. There are definitely challenges associated with every kind of identity that you could occupy. But at the same time, we have to not internalize and think, oh, because this dating world is reflecting back to me that I am this person or this is how I'm valued, it doesn't actually mean that we have to believe in that. Because often what keeps us from finding the people that we're going to connect with is this idea that we have about ourselves and we hold ourselves back. And I strongly believe in you sort of attract what you put out. So if you are wanting to find joy, you're wanting to connect, you have to put that out there. And I don't think we can do that often when we are not able to experience joy because we've internalized the ideologies that people are throwing at us. Thanks.
Go, Dr. Williams. I get my groceries paid.
Yeah. Okay. Later. But then, so I really like this question about the pleasure and the pain bit, because I think a lot of my thinking back through everything I'm interested in, everything I've ended up writing has always been somewhere in the middle. I've been thinking about taking pleasure in causing pain, being a hater, the group chats that I belong to, Bad Mind Brigade, shout out to you guys. And, in particular, just being messy as well. And also all of the spaces that Black people, Black women exist in online where we comment on things. And the act of that commentary being often an inversion of this is causing us pain structurally, but we're going to make fun. So I'm thinking about the death of the monarchy in the UK. There was a 24-hour period of revelry that happens every time, after Prince Philip and after the Queen, which happened right before my Viva as well. So, it's this sort of thing where everyone goes incognito on Twitter, changes all their DPs and, gamonaflage, which is what we call white people in the UK gammons. So then, it's this kind of act of just absolute revelry that happens that's still aware of the harms that could happen to us. So I think a lot about, Moya Bailey's work on alchemy, on generative and defensive alchemy, and the kinds of performances of black feminism that people do without even necessarily calling it as such. So I started out, a lot of this comes from my own like personal experience online. Went to a very predominantly white university. I was at Edinburgh Uni, and I was just existing in a space where I wasn't seeing anyone or interacting with anyone who was like me for months at a time until I got myself back down to London. Every time I was going or whatever, I had to ship my hair stuff up and all things like that. And what I did was, like, in order just to like live, survive, have the things that I needed, the foods, the hair things, the makeup or whatever I needed, I was in these like digital spaces, these black Facebook groups where people were like, swatching makeup on their arms so that I could see what it would look like, because I couldn't get it in, my local shop or whatever. I'd have to order it and stuff. And the ways that we protected and cultivated those spaces, obviously years later I would come back and start interviewing people about this, but I was like really aware that something like very interesting and special was happening there, that we had all of these rules. It's like also ties in with like work and thinking about left book and the kinds of rules that people had to like draw boundaries and lines around these spaces. Like you had to answer questions, or people would be going, admins. I did my time as an admin of a 12,000 person Facebook group called Race Matters. Like it was all really, like on the ground sort of work that people were doing to protect these spaces, to teach each other to love in these spaces as well. These like incredible acts of care that then later on, lots of people were learning about feminism in real time in these spaces as well. So later on, I would go and I was like, oh, do you think what we were doing, like, was that black feminist? Do you call yourself a black feminist? They're like, oh yeah, absolutely, yeah, of course, da, 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 da. And I just thought that was such an interesting route into it. It was this sort of small scale work. And then, so like where I am now, is obviously I was doing this in a very black British context. I am now here. So that's made me think a lot more about the size of these worlds that we occupy and create, and like thinking about it from these global to local lines, which is something that I definitely have pulled from Francesca's work as well. So, who are we as, like, when we're talking about black feminists, black feminism and our groups, like who are we as a collective? Like how do we position ourselves as like, okay, we're globally black, versus like, now this is my specific type of blackness now. And like, thinking about the ways that like global ontologies and understandings of what blackness looks like is represented and, made possible by our actions and our thoughts. And like the kinds of pleasure and pain that happens whilst that's being done, the sort of, we are choosing to like align ourselves and ally ourselves together and elide any sort of cultural or whatever differences that come from being associated with different regions and ethnicities and so on, versus now we're going to have a diaspora war and we're going to talk about exactly why I am this type and your type is silly or whatever, So that's part of it, like, just thinking about being messy, teaching, learning, and like the ways that all is like an incredibly pleasurable and painful experience. I don't know how much time am I going? Yeah, okay. But the last thing I wanted to, like, because I remember when we were talking about this originally, we were like thinking about some examples. And one of the things that I think is a really good example of this happening online, that I haven't spoken about yet, and I probably won't write about it, but like the TikTok black wife effect, which I think is I would love to. So for anyone who isn't familiar, it was this TikTok trend that was trending like, a few weeks ago, something like that, where you would have like a white man and it would be a video of him looking, looking dusty, or just, average or whatever. And then it would be like, oh, and then after I met my black wife, and then suddenly he looks, yeah. Or like, but that like swagged up is about moving towards like a more like racial ambiguity. He's got a fade now, like he's dressing a little nicer. He's got a beard, so that's what a little bit of muscle definition has appeared. So like it was, and I was just interested in that because it was so, it spoke to so many things. It was like, I could see where all the fun was in it, but then also because I'm a hater, I was also, oh, it's a curse. But I was also looking at the pleasure, the pain of being a hater. So I was looking at it and I was thinking, oh man, look, so we're fixing up these white men, the sort of, the mammying part of it. I was like, the magical Negro bit of like, yeah, and like a lot of people were a bit upset about parts of that, but then, and the fact that this wasn't a mutual shaping happening, that, the black woman always looked amazing, but she's come along and fixed some like, dusty man. Anyway, so, but I think that like, also you have to afford some grace. So that took me back as well. And I was like, yeah, but we've also, and especially like, again, turning back to dating and so on, from like it's not easy dating in the UK as a black woman, especially as well. Like, you know, there's parts of the country you can go to and you're just like, you're not even a woman, you're like maybe just an amusing dog type of thing. Like, it's just not like, you're not read, the index of attractiveness changes where you go. Like, you're not read as like fully, yeah? So part of that, you're like, yes, I understand why there's these tensions around dating and interracial dating and so on, and, you know, not to get into it or anything. But then I spoke to Brandy just now, who gave an incredibly generous reading of it as well, which I think is lovely and comes back to the pleasure aspect, which is like, you could read that as these white men getting their shit together to be worthy of a black woman, which I thought was so lovely and, you know, shows like that I really am like a hater down to the bone because it didn't even occur to me until then. But yeah, so like, I think that's like some of the sort of messiness of like thinking about pleasure and pain and how it appears online with like the multiple readings that are possible for that. I'll stop now, sorry.
Don't stop. Yeah, I just want to really express my gratitude for the opportunity to be here with you all. It's, yeah, there aren't words for it, and I feel like this is the pleasure in practice. And some of the things I've been thinking about relate to a lot of what's been shared this morning, and is very much shaped by just, I don't even want to just say all of your words and works, but just who all of you are. And some of that includes thinking through the ways that pleasure and pain exists at once in these messy ways that is always beyond binaries. And part of that led me to think a little bit about some of my experiences with different folks, including in the context of Scotland, where I lived for around about 20 years and was born, and then Wales, where I've lived for about 5 years as someone of Nigerian and Welsh heritage. And I share that because some of the work that I've been involved in has focused on forms of multilingual ways of working. So this has included a project with independent writer and organizer Layla Roxanne Hill, and we co-created a graphic novel with a number of incredible people, which was available and is available in English, Scots, and Scottish Gaelic. And throughout that process, we thought a lot about different questions to do with the pleasure and pain that can be involved in language and ways of communicating and expressing. So conversations with people such as Naomi Gusesi, who translated the writing to Scottish Gaelic, conversations around what does it mean when the direct translation of a word is actually a word that is reinforcing oppressiveness? How can we think about the intention to bring pleasure to the forefront of this, and especially with the focus on children and young people? Again, to bring it back to what was generously shared earlier today, we really wanted this to be something that we would have liked to have read as children in Scotland in the 80s and 90s. And I say that because I think there is a playfulness in language and ways of communicating, but there can be so much pain in that too. And more recently, we've been working with lots of different people and a collective to think about being Black out here and there in Scotland and Wales. And we're working on an online exhibition and sort of ongoing sharing. And as part of that, we've had conversations whereby people have thrown out the question around, why does any of this have to be shared in English, in Welsh? When we're speaking about languages, why is it that often we're focusing on languages that are Eurocentric languages? And this means that the way we're hoping or we're going to approach this is people sharing in different ways with different languages, written, verbal, visual, oral, and otherwise, and sort of placing an emphasis on the fact that we don't need to understand exactly every single thing of what every single person is saying at all times for us to connect, relate, appreciate our differences, and find ways of coming together collectively, and also sort of uplifting the specificity of what it means to be each of who everybody is in different places at different points in time. And on that note, I want to also mention a bit about the work of Emily and Ponsa, who's part of a wonderful collective, a Black Belgio-Dutch collective that recently created a film that really focuses on Black intimacy and the poetics of that. And there's so much just art, awe, love in all of what they've put together, and I had the opportunity to see some of that in Amsterdam earlier this year because they've been sharing it in a whole host of different ways. And again, I was in a space where people said from the beginning, this is going to move between and with and weave throughout lots of different languages. And as somebody who doesn't speak anything fluently other than English and is very conscious of how that reflects, oppressive histories and geopolitics, I was in that space feeling and sensing and connecting to people in ways that involved language, but was always about more than that. So I guess I say that because I've been thinking a lot about multimedia and multilingual ways of experiencing and embracing pleasure, and also ways of sharing about pain, but also doing so with a sense of like opacity, and that sort of relates to what you were saying about, there's times when there's withholding for very important reasons. And in academia, there's often conversations about accessibility and openness in ways that don't tend to, Black feminism and the power of boundaries and the power of forms of disengaging and turning away from and turning towards and refusal, exactly that. So it's just a pleasure to be here. And it's I think the last thing I'll say is, when I kept thinking about the pleasure in all of this, I thought a lot about asynchronicity. And as somebody who's always found comfort in asynchronous ways of communicating, because my mind is often moving at a pace that I don't feel as though my words can keep up with, I'm conscious that a lot of the ways that we've maybe all communicated at times have been asynchronously, and I think there's a beauty and pleasure in that, but also a sense of like wonder in being able to experience this right now. And yeah, I think the past, the present, the future is always alchemized again to sort of turn to the words and the works of Moya Bailey in the here and now. And that's why, as was mentioned this morning by Stephanie, when we think about, Afro-Nowism, it's not that we're disengaging from a past, and it's not that we're not acknowledging the force or the power of the future, but we're refusing these binary notions. And we're also doing so in ways that embrace Black life and death and go beyond Western notions of life as presence and excess and death as deficit and absence, and that means always thinking about and being with ancestors in the process.
Ooh. Thank you so much. I'm gonna try to ask some questions, but I just want y'all to talk. So whatever you feel like talking about. I mean, as I'm listening to everyone here think through ideas of what's the messiness of existing not between some bifurcation of pain and pleasure, but the acknowledgement of their coexistence in our realities, in our linguistic discourse, but also in our communal spaces and the way that we experience these platforms. I'm thinking about spaces online like TikTok, where we might see, and we did see, and I don't know how many folks remember this, the Black women on TikTok's refusal and withholding of dance, right? There was this kind of moment I alluded to earlier, right, where Meg Thee Stallion's Thot Shit comes out, and Black girls said, we're not gonna make you all a dance for this, because you keep stealing our dances, you keep getting recognized for it, you keep making money off of our creativity, and we're gonna see what happens when you don't have us to steal from. And it was lovely, right? It was like that beautiful kind of moment of hating, right? Of let's just watch folks flop when they don't know what to do without Black women and Black girls doing this work for them. And I bring that up for a couple of reasons, because I think that example allows us to think about a few things. Is one, that kind of interplay between pleasure and pain, right? The pleasure in other folks' pain, for one, right? That is a real thing, which is actually not about resistance so much. And I think that's really important to Brandy's point, that it's really about the actual experience of pleasure for pleasure's sake. I think David reminded us of that earlier. But also it allows us to think about the messiness and complications of how we do this kind of work in digital platforms that are built on the commodification of Black women's work and labor. And not just Black women's work, but all of our labor, right? Like TikTok runs on an algorithm that requires this kind of production, this kind of content creation as a mechanism for it to stay alive. And then by that means, many of us are disenfranchised from actually getting the benefits from it. So how do we think about Black women's pleasure and pain within a digital context of platforms that are not Facebook, right, that are not Twitter, that are not gaming consoles, that are not perhaps these enclave spaces where Black women have gotten together and made decisions and had some sense of agency, but instead this new kind of context of a digital platform that requires our performance for money, right, for pay. So I just want us to kind of think about the messiness of that as well.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the sort of public privateness of spaces, and in that, obviously, yeah, the way that we operate in spaces that are purely for us, these enclaves, is very different to the public-facing spaces, like, I mean, Twitter, X now, or whatever, like, and the way that changes the way we behave. But I think what really always was interesting to me is the way that we adapt and work with and work around the affordances of these different spaces to make them do the things that we want them to do anyway. So, you'll be on Twitter, like, I have a haters group chat on every platform. So, you know what I mean? Like, that's, of course, it's the same people, but the point is, it's like, it's easier for me to send. So we have one on Instagram, so it's easy to DM to that one, Bad Mind Brigade on Insta. And then there's the one on Twitter, which is Bad Mind Brigade, the original one. Then there's also a WhatsApp group in case people aren't checking either. You know what I mean? So, like, the point is that, like, we create the enclave within the wider thing. So we'll do our, the public-facing hateful behaviors, but also the private-facing. Like, it's just the creativity and the inventiveness that's required to still have, navigate a space and make it do what you want it to do is, like, an important one, I think. Especially these sort of, like, catch-all platforms and spaces that sort of float above the rest of them. Like, I'm very interested in the use of things like WhatsApp across the diaspora and so on, I was so surprised when I got here and everyone was using iMessage, because I don't think I'd actually, like, texted before I came to the US. Like, I was always on WhatsApp for everything. But, got here and everyone was, using iMessage and stuff. So that, and, having the group chats on WhatsApp and so on was, like, a really important way of keeping, your group, like, able to still, like, navigate. I think of the ways that, we use these networks as, like, being at the center of a network and using them for different reasons, and, like, having some of them, the way that, like, hypertext and hypermedia works across, things, information flows from different ones, and, the way that Black women in particular in these sort of ways, like, center themselves in the center of the network. Like, the center is where I am, and then everything else sort of, like, flows around me, and I, moderate that flow the way that I want to.
This reminds me of, like, the one of those womanist tenets that, we don't separate ourselves except for the case of, like, health. And also makes me think of, in Living Color, Benita Boutrell, where the iMessage, the group chat, the WhatsApp, the DM space is the, you ain't heard that from me, you know what I'm saying? That kind of thing. And I think that separation in these spaces acts in that way, because at times the things that you might want to say might not be so popular, or it might not help you, it might hurt you. So you're separating yourself for reasons of health. In the womanist, like, as a womanist tenet, if we're going to take this as, like, a scholarly kind of ideal, and the ways of, like, feminist and what Black women's being, and how folks regulate themselves both on public-facing digital platforms, and then use the digital or space, the privatization of that, the behind the scenes, as the Benita Boutrell kind of, like, but, They don't know a Living Color?
I was about to say, show hands.
I don't know a Living Color.
We too old. You do. I ain't talking about you collectively. I ain't talking about y'all. I mean collectively.
Okay, so in Living Color was a show in the 90s, the weigh-ins.
Sketch comedy show.
Yeah, it was like a comedy, like a Saturday Night Live, but done by Black folks. And Benita Boutrell was a woman that would sit outside her window and say, "Hey, girl, how you doing? Hey," and it'd be like, her kids don't know how to do this. Blah, blah, blah.
Messy. The messy politics. Messy.
But she would say it offline, like, as a, but you ain't heard that from me. You know what I'm saying? No, you have not.
I think the contemporary is, like, on, like, reality shows now, Real Housewives, when they have, like, the screens where they're by themselves doing the messy work. I feel like that's, like, the equivalent of that now. No,
showing
you
my
good.
age.
No, we old. It's okay, we old.
See, if you
We
follow
old.
me on Twitter, you'll see that my banner image is Benita Boutrell. Because I believe in that. But it's a separation that is a necessary thing to be able to express yourself outside of this thing, because we have the kitchen table concept as Black women congregate online, right? Yeah. But then there's levels to this, and that is the level. There is that public that we're gonna be all messy together, and talk about somebody very publicly, like, he gotta go, whatever, or she gotta go. And then there's that other back channel that is the WhatsApp, that is the iMessage or whatever, that is even more private and also is a space that you separate yourself for reasons of health or wellness.
Even that visual of that, like her at the window and then her going back into the home, like it's really like a beautiful move. I love that. Yeah.
No, I think, I want to go back to something that April said earlier about this reinforcement of the economies of desire. And I think particularly Key and April, if you all would expand a little bit on this for me, because so much of what we are discussing so far is to Rihanna's point, the way that even given the constraints of the platform, Black women have found these mechanisms to do what has always been done, to use, creative ingenuity around technology and around our discursive practice and around our cultural heritage. But I am interested in us kind of sitting for a minute with the realities of our existence within these platforms and what ideologically it means for us to situate ourselves in an economy of desire that teaches us and that is quantifying, I think is how you put it, our pleasure and pain. And when we become accustomed to the notion that pleasure only exists in so much as it's quantified through the mechanisms of the platform, or pain only exists in that. If we're thinking about reporting systems of harassment, does this count as pain if it's not recognized by the system that I'm using it? Is this actually pleasure if there's no way for me to show other people that it is happening right now, right, through dating or through gaming? So I'd love if you all would talk a little bit about your work in relationship to how platforms are creating these economies for us that really are having implications for our own ideological well-being and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if people have seen, there's a Black woman right now on TikTok who had a profile on Hinge as a Black woman. She says she was locked up in Rhodes jail forever. She couldn't get out. She couldn't get matches. Then she deleted everything, came back and marked her ethnicity or her race as white, kept the same pictures. So she's still a Black woman, but she marked her ethnicity as white, and her matches have been popping off ever since then, right? Meaning that it's not that individuals that were seeing her were like, no, you're Black, it's a no for me. It means that the algorithm that was built into Hinge was not showing her to as broad of an audience because they build within these traditional knowledges of beauty, attractiveness, desirability, and worthiness and think, oh, these folks don't want to see this kind of Black woman. When in actuality, they did want to see her because now she's having a thriving dating life, all by marking herself as white. But what does it say that a Black woman has to mark herself as white, even though she is still visually and authentically herself, right? But to get around the algorithm, she's having to say, I'm white now. So if we think about that, and that kind of programming, I'll just say, is like pretty constant across dating platforms. They all share information. That means that they are doing ideological work to create really cultural ideology about who and what is attractive and also acceptable. You have to perform a certain kind of femininity or masculinity, and if you don't fit within those boxes, then the apps are sort of saying, well, you're in the margins, you're in the side, right? So definitely there are mechanisms in platforms that do serve to create cultural taste, right, and aesthetic. And if you don't fit within that, you might find yourself trying to move towards that so that you can participate in this desirability economy, which I'm not saying is right or wrong, because people do what they have to do, right? If you're finding that you have to move in a certain way, which Black women often do, sometimes we just do what we got to do.
Thank you for asking that question. I'm thinking about something that I talk about in class, that we talk a lot about in our work, is how can this stuff like be measured, right? Just as you were talking like in that example, I think the question I had was, how did she feel having to do that? You know, how do we feel having to do a lot of those kinds of things? Hiding aspects of our identity, shielding and masking like in different ways, like, you know, so I'm sitting with that, but that's just a question. We could talk about it later. But then in measuring, inside gaming, there was a time Xbox didn't realize the extent, I think it was a lie all along, they knew it, but they didn't realize the extent of like sexism and racism, right? And so in their mind, they were looking at what's documented and what's reported, right, inside those spaces. So thinking about reporting systems, like we have to report our pain. We have to report the instances of the harms that are happening to us. However, for a long time, there was not a place anywhere inside gaming to report racism. Those words did not exist in the reporting structure. Sexism did not exist, and I'm so sorry that Gamergate had to happen in order for us to get gender-based harassment reporting mechanisms inside these platforms. Harms had to happen. Widespread collective harms had to happen in order to get those kinds of things. And then I had to ask the question. I remember sitting with, some of the groups of ladies inside that space, and I said, if you were to report the harms that you experience, would you even use the word harassment? And all of these black women said, no, that's white woman shit. They said, no, that's white woman shit. And I asked them, I was like, if you were to describe, the harms that you experience inside gaming, what would be the phrases or the words or the terminology that you might use? Overwhelming majority of the time, they said, that's fuck boys doing fuck boy shit. They use that's the word. Fuck shit, fuck nigga shit, fuck, that's what they said. And I was like, well, I don't know if Microsoft will write that down, but I'll let them know. I'm not sure if Microsoft will write these words so we can capture that. But I think that was just that disjointedness of what's happening on the ground inside these communities and how the system at the top cannot capture those kinds of things, right? On the other hand, there was really a segment of the community that even framed it back in the old days. This was, 2008 and 9. They really framed it as snitching. I ain't snitching. I ain't worried about it. I'm a G. I ain't worried about what's happening to me out here. I ain't worried about being called no N-word. I ain't worried about that. I'm like, okay, those are choices and decisions too, right? And then at the time, I was hopeful for what these technologies could afford. I'm like, if we let them know, they'll do something about it. Wrong. I don't know where I'm going with this. But, one more thing that I was going to say. The other thing that I realized, too, is that being in the gaming space is really interesting. And I wasn't in the social media space until social media came to gaming, the convergence of those technologies. Whenever Facebook came and Twitter came, and then we could share. And in fact, I think that Gamergate was exasperated, was amplified because so much of those aspects of our personal gaming identities, our gamer tags, our usernames inside that space, we could see it in social media now. And so people were finding us and looking for us. And so the harms came. And so many people said, shut social media down, because actually, even gamers, the majority of gamers said social media is worse than gaming. They actually say this, that there is no way to protect yourself, that Zuck and Musk, those, folks are not gonna protect us in ways that they feel like that if we can shield off ourselves, go in these spaces by ourselves, and we're protected and we're shielded from the harms that we might experience in those spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, I also wanted to follow up on that just because I sat in with a session at a social media company who also has a dating platform. So I'll just put that out there. Use your imagination, figure out who it might be. But when I'm talking to them about racial fetishization and how they are sort of framing this in their apps and how they're letting people run wild saying things like, oh, well, I only like snow bunnies, or, no fast, no femmes, no Asians. I said, what are y'all gonna do about that? What's your plan for that? They said, oh, we're not gonna do anything. That's freedom of speech. What are you talking about? We're just gonna let people do that. And so when I was trying to sort of say, do you know what racial fetishization is? It was blank. Nobody knew. And they didn't have any intention of saying, oh, we're gonna stop doing this, right? On the other hand, I have talked to some other folks like Match and Hinge and Tinder and have said, you guys have to have a reporting mechanism for people who are experiencing racial harassment. And I think they're turning the tide a little bit, but it's not because they want to, it's because they know that if they don't, they lose out on our money, right? And so we always talk about how, there's no clean money, there's no justice under capitalism. There's not, but we also have to play their game. And if it means voting with our dollars, we should act accordingly, right? It's if you're not gonna protect us, you're not gonna protect communities that are experiencing harm online, then we're not gonna use your platform.
I love this conversation. I mean, what I'm hearing from y'all is that the system either can't or doesn't want to capture the pain of Black women, right, through their reporting mechanisms. So I guess maybe I'm gonna shift the conversation in the opposite direction and ask, does the system of academia? Does our research practice want or have mechanisms not only to capture the pain of Black women, but I would say more so to capture the pleasure of Black women? And how do we see the work that we do being made more possible or shut down through the methods, through the publishing practice, and through the systems of research that would allow us to perhaps talk about the pleasure of Black women through our work and our research as well?
I've got thoughts. So a brief thought for now, but a lot more thoughts if anybody wants to know them. I think this relates to some of what you were speaking about earlier today and what other people have been speaking about to do with Black joy. And I've been thinking about this a lot with Emily and Ponsa, who I mentioned as part of a collective, Black Speaks Back. And we've been thinking about this in the context of Belgium and Britain, academia, and in both places, and the histories of both of those places, and the extent to which institutions do or don't acknowledge the histories of those places. And I say that because we've been focusing on demands, displays, and dreams of Black joy, is what we've been referring to as part of a forthcoming article. And that's involved us reflecting on times when we see institutions trying to demand a certain institutionalized and outright anti-Black framing of convivial Black joy. And what we mean by that is the distinct difference between institutions expecting and demanding what might be viewed as a performance or representation of a certain, I don't even want to say, I think the only word for it is just anti-Blackness at work, and the way that intersects with misogyny, sexism, ableism, transphobia, Islamophobia, and so many different forms of oppression, whereby whether or not it was, last year, the year before, the years before that, we see institutions at certain points in time suddenly coming forward with a poster, a campaign, a social media post. And in the case of some of the work we've been doing, we've looked at some of what universities have posted on social media, whereby they were trying to create the impression of being a place or a space where Black people might experience joy. And we've been doing that whilst also saying, we want to focus, though, on the everydayness of joy in the life of black folks. And we want to do that in a way that means really emphasizing the expansiveness of all of that beyond any institutional context. And again, thinking about it beyond these binaries of life and death or joy and trauma, which institutions love to peddle. So I feel as though this relates to a lot of what people shared earlier today, whereby institutions will try and demand self-excavation, or they want you to perform not even emotions, but they just want you to perform, period. And I think for me, this is where the joy and pleasure really comes through, is in the lack of the engagement with any form of expectation of performance. And that often means working in ways that are never for or within the institution. They're always beyond, besides, and otherwise. And this also relates to some of what was said earlier on, which means recognizing the limitations of academia. I think there's a big difference between working at universities and subscribing to academia as a system. And I think, all of what we're speaking about and the work that everybody does is critical of that, and says that the joy we're dealing with exists despite all of this, as opposed to being something that's enabled by it, because these are not joyful institutions or systems, and they certainly are not places that want to nurture joy in any meaningful way.
Can I add to that tiny? Yeah, so yes, absolutely. And I think that, it makes me think about the fact that until I got here, especially no one really ever asked me about my research. I came here and I was finally asked to talk about what I actually studied, because my whole experience in the UK was always so what's it like being the only Black person here? I was the only Black PhD student my department has ever had. They had another one briefly, and then they left, and so it's that the environment that we were in, where we're constantly asked to parade our pain as well, in the summer of 2020. I remember I was told to host a department, bear in mind, PhD student, absolutely not employed to go to departmental meetings or anything like that, but asked to host a Black Lives Matter meeting for all the faculty. And then, but yeah, for faculty. And then also was told that like I'd been, oh God, I saw it in an email chain that I probably wasn't supposed to be on. That it was like, because I was like part of BLM UK. And I was like, oh, well, it was really interesting. I was like, no, I'm just black, actually. You know, like I'd done like little 1-2 interviews with them for like some, you know, for a student newspaper or something, but like I absolutely was not like on the ground in that way. So thank you. So, you know, that kind of work and being asked to parade like pain all the time in order to receive, and the trade-off was to receive the funds that I needed, like be visible in the places. You know, I was one of very few black people who was funded, but also funded by like my funding body. So my visibility there means I'm still to this day up and down their website. But it means I will always receive funding for my projects from them. Like, and I know that. Like, I still know that. It's like, I'm gone. They've made an alumni. You know what I mean? So it's the kind of like the trade-off that you have to do in order to redistribute the funds where they need to go. Which I thought was like, you know, it's a really interesting like performance of like working with the institution. And you don't even have like, they also know I'm a hater about it as well. Like, it's not like I didn't really have to perform to the degree where it was like, oh, thank you so much, like kind of thing. But, you know, it still was necessary to participate in order to do the work that I really wanted to do, which was at the kitchen table. So we were always doing stuff, and, you know, especially with, you know, Francesca and stuff, we had our little old academia writing groups, you know, rent an Airbnb and go sit and, you know, write in a cottage in Cardiff and things like that. So, you know, to be able to access that work, we had to do some of these things, but it wasn't, you know, it wasn't the sum of my work, it wasn't the sum of who I was, and it also allowed me to make the, you know, use the clout to make connections where I really wanted to be and do the things I really wanted to do. So.
I have 12 more questions, but I think the better idea instead is, with the 15 minutes or so that we have left, to see if folks want to engage with us as well. We'd love to be in conversation. So if there are questions from folks around the room or online, we'd love to engage.
Good afternoon. It's great to see each of you all. You all are the scholars on my wall. But one question that I had is, when you were talking about, I wrote it down, just that concept of, I guess, freedom in terms of free speech and how people do that in online spaces. My question was, and to whoever would like to answer it, do you think there's ever a point where the freedom of speech is just masking hateful ideology?
Free speech is for white people. Yes, free speech is for white people. It's created by and for white people to protect white ideology. If we come through with free speech, we're losing our jobs. Yeah. Quite often.
Have to do the, you know, when I mentioned the camouflage situation, you know, going incognito, was like, you know, there was an awareness that if, like, everyone had to be in real lockstep about this in the UK, like, you know, if you say the wrong thing, then like a horde of like white supremacists are going to descend on you, you might lose your job type of thing. So like this performance of like, everyone knew that they had to perform whiteness for a little while in order to be able to say what they needed to say, like even just adopting like that whiteness to be able to have some free speech. So it's like a real, like really clear.
Hey, it's Aria. I just want to say thank you for offering some words I wrote at some point to the space, because I didn't even remember I said that. That was dope. But and then y'all are just dope, because I have so many questions and thoughts. I want to go back to the black wife effect. I'm sorry, I gotta tiptoe back there just a bit. And I am interested in the question about, I think Rihanna offered, what is happening to the black women, right? If the black wife effect is creating, and you said getting these white men towards some kind of racial ambiguity, which again, write that shit, by the way, because I need it for class, thanks. What is happening to the black women? And I'm currently in an ongoing argument with my sister, my older sister, about what happens in the black wife effect. And her argument is that the black women get to navigate blackness differently. And I was wondering what your thoughts might be, not just about the black wife effect, but kind of going largely about all the things that y'all are talking about in terms of like black women having to mask our experiences, to what is a performance trade-off in these institutions, right? We have to perform a type of whiteness. What is happening? Because we're giving our institutions the blackness effect. They're getting the black girl effect, perhaps. So then what is happening? And we know what happens to us in those spaces in many ways, right? But then what happens to those institutions? What do they get, right? Your trade-off, like as you said, Rihanna, was like, okay, yeah, I can always call on them to give me $1, but then what does the institution get? What does the white husband get?
I mean, I think I really appreciate the fact that this is happening on TikTok. And so I'm going to do the thing where I talk about like the platform for a bit, right? Also, because, you know, the black wife effect as a cultural phenomenon only is possible in a space like TikTok that's heavily reliant on this visuality, and it's also reliant on this mimetic nature where people are repeating the same content again and again, right? So this doesn't, I think, circulate in the same way in a text-based platform, nor in a platform that doesn't require that of us, that kind of performance. It also doesn't exist outside of a space that already made space for hard wig, soft life. Right, and so that also emerging in TikTok, so for those who aren't familiar, hard wig, soft life is the idea of black women in relationships with white men who stop doing their hair because you don't have to anymore. You have a really bad wig, right? And that really bad wigs actually attract the attention of a certain class of white men, right, who have money and are whatever. So this all happens within the same kind of digital milieu and context. And I think that that matters because I think that the ability not to have that conversation, but for that to become a part of our public like vernacular where she says that and everybody goes, ha ha, we know what's going on here. We can also attribute that to what happens to these platforms because of the participation of black women, right? So black women I mean, TikTok gets the black wife effect because when it is cool within the black community, when these spaces become something that black folks pick up as a place that we can commune and we can share discursive practice and share mimetic ideas, right, then the platform benefits. And the platform benefits most substantially and more substantially than the individual content creators who do, in some part, gather resources from their performance on those sites. And I think the same thing is true for offline institutions as well, right? We have to be realistic about what the give and the take is. And that's why I appreciate Ree's point about this, right? That our participation in these institutions is, of course, better for the institution than it is for us. But we should not pretend that we don't gain something out of it, because when we do that, we place ourselves in this situation where we act like we're doing this activist work that we're not paid for. And I think we have to be very clear as black women scholars who make money from writing about racism and misogynoir in these academic spaces and are paid by white institutions and white funding agencies, that we do a disservice when we don't recognize the kind of distance that is created through that power dynamic of our research, right? So it gives us the opportunity, I think, to be a little bit more reflexive about what we gain from this and how much we are committed to continuing to gain and have our profit be based on writing about black pain as well, right? Like, it gives us a space to really interrogate that in a more complex way, and hopefully a space for us to see that translational work between the content that we're studying and actually then what we are doing also as researchers.
All right, thank you for everything. I have a quick question. We were talking about academics, and I was wondering, when we are looking at pain and pleasure, especially black and brown perspective, does it mean we have to shift how we demonstrate, reconceptualize, and discuss knowledge? And do we even have to share everything with these audiences who don't even really, to be frank, want us to be there?
You answered your own question, right? I think, so just to let you know, I'm an ethnographer. I study humans that were online and online gamings, right? The majority of what folks share with me have never been published and will not ever be published. We talked a lot too. There was a moment in 2014, you all may or may not remember, the movement for Black Lives in Ferguson. I was in Ferguson. We did a lot of data collection, extraction. I was on a team, a lot of unethical, awful practices. A lot of people published that work. I refused to ever publish anything on that during that time, right? So I think even how you talked about it, I think it's important that we have an ethic of care about the research, about the work that we do, about the communities that we're in. And we really have to do that reflexive work to think about, why am I here? What am I doing? And to not be fooled into thinking that we're doing something for these communities and we're gonna make their lives so much better. No, we're not. So we don't need to act like that we are. What, your little $100 gift card is gonna transform their lives? Like, come on now. Like, what are we doing? So we have to be, I think what we should approach it to do no more harm, right? And to also just be upfront and open, like with the communities. Yeah, I remember like being in these spaces, and I remember telling them who I was, what I'm doing. And I remember like there were some scholars that were like, that's, you can't take away your power, don't give them all. I'm like, what you mean, power? What are you talking about? Like, there are just the higher, there's a lot I'd like to say. I think I'm bothered, especially when we see like a lot of our people who look like us do a lot of research, and it's very problematic, the things that black folks have done in communities that they claim that they're a part of, and they've done so much harm in service to the academic institution, to the white academic institution. And so I think that we have to be active and intentional whenever we're inside these spaces, and just do no more harm. I'm not gonna
I think also just like the shift between yourself as like the further into academia that I've gotten, the more I realized that, like I was writing about, in the thesis, I was writing like, I'm part of this community. I've been in this group for years. The reason they're even talking, the reason I'm even allowed in here is because I've been in here for 5 years before I did the PhD, and this is the only reason they want to talk to me. Now, if I turn around and do that now, I don't know that I can still. It's not true anymore. It's not true anymore. Like so like I'm gonna have to renegotiate my relationship to those spaces and continue as unless I quit and open my bakery. Never know. But then so in doing that, in like reframing yourself as like a collaborator as well. So, thinking about ethnography again, thinking about like the interview processes and stuff, trying not to like alter what people, being heavy on the dialogue side of things and so on. All of those kinds of choices. Like I think about my group chat as also co-writers, group chat as method, thinking about the ways that I receive information. Because like myself as a researcher, yes, I'm here, I'm looking or whatever, I'm watching and whatever. But a large part of the time, what actually makes it in as a thing of interest is the stuff that someone has DM'd me going, Rihanna, I know what you're researching. Have you caught this? I've got screenshots for you. I've got screenshots for you. Because
that's right.
Yeah, like half the time it's not my screenshots in there. Like I'm giving credit. I'm citing that they're talking. They are talking through me or whatever. So like that's the like best I can do, I think, rather than trying to make myself the arbiter of it all.
I'm just so happy that the conversation turned to methods. You know me, that makes me so happy. But I think we have time for one more question. So I think there was an online question.
Yeah. So this is from Kyra Gaunt, and they're asking you to complete this BET exam question, in parentheses, Black entertainment tweets, and don't limit yourself to logical formalism. Messy is to nuance as...
Read, you got it? Read that shit. I don't even know. Read that. What did they say? What's Kira say? They got an answer?
No.
I'm going to take this moment to remind everyone that I am not from here. Thank you.
I'm thinking about, especially as you were talking, I'm thinking about how, especially when we approach like methods, we think it's like these clean cut things that, it's prescripted 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's really messy when we're in there. Methods are messy, these approaches like are messy. And I think when we acknowledge that part, that I think the work is like so benefits so much more. Like when we acknowledge those things, I think that's why I struggled so much. And I often say I failed research methods, like, because when you get that B, it's really a fail. They hated me. And I didn't do well in research methods because I realized it didn't speak to me. Thinking about womanist approaches, Black feminist approaches, when I learned intersectionality, my brain just transformed, and those things, one was not like the other anymore for me, And so I don't know. I'm sorry, Kira. We love you though. I'm sorry.
I've got a few thoughts which I don't know if they do or don't relate to this, but I guess I feel like nuance is a word that people love to invoke to try and excuse addressing the messiness of things, whether it's methods, whether it is pleasure, pain, the plainness of the everydayness of that, and working within institutions, being critical of academia whilst also acknowledging how we benefit from it. So I feel like messiness is a word that I feel my shoulders drop when we speak about messiness. And as someone who feels messiness in every which way, in relation to their own experience of neurodivergence, in relation to the way that a sense of linear time is just not something that feels as though I can connect to it, but we're asked to present or share ideas in these beginning, middle, and end ways. I feel like messiness provides space for like the reality of life, whereas nuance is like an intellectualized way of often acknowledging messiness and erasing it and saying we're not going to go there. It's like we're gonna invoke nuance to say that things are complex, but we're not going to actually speak about the messiness, and that is part of that complexity.
That's so. Oh, do it.
Yeah. It's hate is the critique.
I was gonna say living single is to friends. And it. Well, I think that. Oh, Kevin has. You have time? Oh, okay. Go ahead.
He does have the time. You got the time. Go ahead. Do it.
That's self-explanatory.
Oh, I appreciate y'all so much. Each of you have influenced my work, and I'm a social movement scholar, and I struggle with the binaries, right? The pleasure, pain, blackness is always political, or kind of the everyday life of it, and I'm really struggle trying to replace that metaphor or that model with something different. I don't want it to be so broad to be like, well, so what is blackness? But like if it's not in that, if those two things aren't in tension, then what should I be replacing that with, right? Because as I'm hearing you all talk about traversing kind of these public spheres, it is with an external gaze of some sort that you are navigating. So I struggle with like this a version of everyday life that's not also struggling with this political external thing. And even as, when we talk about gender, gender and that male gaze as well, right? So can you point me in the right direction, I guess is what I'm saying.
And I think
it's hard.
But I think on purpose, right? Because you and I have had this conversation, and I think it's because so much of our disciplinary training points us toward having to have either the binary, right, or that tension being the impulse for the project itself, that we are a problem, and we are a problem to be resolved. And the way that we resolve that problem is by defining ourselves against or in opposition to something else that is not problematic, right? And so I think what we're pointing out is that sitting in the mess is actually the point, right? Sitting in the complexity, in the nuance, but really in the messiness of it, and actually understanding that the messiness is the point, instead of like trying to find our way through the messiness to a clear idea of what this thing is. We are both doing political things and sending memes. We are both experiencing pleasure and pain. And that I guess that last question I asked was really about the fact that so many of our methods, so many of our ways that we're disciplined into writing requires us to move that out, right? And to get to the answer by the end. This is really what was going on here. See, the people were actually resisting, and that's why they were braiding each other's hair. And I'm like, no, they were braiding each other's hair. Like her scalp was itching because you need her hair braided before she went to the pool. Like it was just, there was things happening, right? And that I think we need to be more insistent within our academic spaces, particularly those who gain some modicum of power in terms of what gets published and how it gets published and what we recognize as real scholarship and what counts as real research, to say that yes, the mess is the point of it. The experimental nature of our methods are the point of it, that we're not actually looking for the one resolute answer to what blackness is or what people are doing in that space or what is right. And we need to stop pointing our work towards an opposition to a problematic, right? Like we are a problem to be resolved. So yeah.
That's right. That's one of the things that I've been playing with in visual culture, especially as we get more kind of archives online of like Black everyday life, is like this idea of the Black mundane. And mundane seems like it's a bad word, right? Like, oh, do we really want to say mundane in academic work? It doesn't really sound nice. But I do mean it in the very like ordinary sense of the everydayness of Black life that has been out of the pointed view, that is not a counter, to the ways in which we've everybody is trained to experience us. And the way, not just the we kind of as academics put things out, because that's the way that we've been taught to put things out, but also the way that there is like this outside kind of like visual culture of us, and then this interiority of the way that we expressed our visual culture in our own personal archives. And that personal, like just for me as like a visual culture scholar, is mundane as hell, you know, and that's the part that's almost denied in the experience. And then it's the part that people can't really grapple with, like, oh, well, who are you if you're not resisting, or who are you if you're not doing this? And that is the part that is that this kind of era that it is messy and it's new and it's a little bit difficult, because we don't want to say mundane because we're so stuck on like black girl magic and you know, and all this stuff, and black exceptionalism and all this stuff. It is like that's the one, black excellence, and I like this term online. That's like, no, like regular. I want to like not be exceptional. I want to be like, I'm saying I want to be regular, black regular. Like I want to eat an ice cream and stare out into space, you know. And it's hard, you know. I think that's difficult, especially for people who are like, we are type A. We're out here doing the things, you know, becoming doctors and writing books and all this stuff. That is that, but at the same time, it is exhausting, you know, and we don't always have to be doing that. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank y'all for sitting with these regular black women, talking about regular black people things. Thank you so much. I think we are moving into a break, yes? So let's thank the panel, please.
That's my cue. So, yep, we've got a break now until 2:30, and this is just a reminder that coffee cart around the corner is there until 4 p.m. Okay, see you soon.